words roll right off of him, his whole mind focused on the task at hand. Single-mindedness could be a boon at times. She'd known Ivan long enough to see that prove useful, but it also limited how much one could adapt in the moment. In this case, it was a positive, as seeing his leader unbothered gave Tashionic his own sense of assurance back. They weren't getting better, but them fighting while shaken would hardly have improved things either. Another team attack, though this time, they stayed more in sync, arriving in perfect unison. This tactic was shockingly close to a choreographed dance, two men filling the space of one by expertly weaving in and out of the other's way. For a moment, it was as if Lodestar were fighting a four-armed monster, blows raining in from all directions. The trouble was, no matter how much they worked together, they were still ultimately two separate people. Agent Quantum's fists were too slow, and Tashionic's were too weak. She let the attack run for several seconds before deciding she'd seen all it had to offer. A single blow to the gut sent Tashionic staggering back, and with a burst of motion, Lodestar slipped behind Agent Quantum, knocking him off balance with a hard strike to the spine. You're used to fighting people weaker than you, maybe ones on your level. When Professor Quantum tests you against harder opponents, they're always mechanical, and not the sentient type. That means they're limited, predictable, easy to defeat once you learn their patterns. A rapid series of shots from Plasmodiia tore through the air, ones that Lodestar easily sidestepped, seemingly unbothered. This might feel unfair, but understand, I'm not even using your team's full capabilities right now. If I was hitting with Plasmodiia's stopping power, you'd both be down already. Our world isn't balanced in how it gives out abilities. Some get the strength to shake mountains, others can turn soda into water. You cannot assume your position will always be that of the stronger fighter. This is just what it will be like to fight someone who is both fast and strong, a combination you'll eventually find if you fight enough Metis. Tashionic let out a dusty snicker as he rose to his feet. You might be right, but it's a little rich to get that advice coming from Lodestar. I wasn't born with these powers. That was all she managed before another blast ripped through the air. Unlike prior shots, this was closer to target and far more dangerous. A nearby mesa got clipped, resulting in a hole bored through the rock. Plasmodiia was stepping things up. Or was she? Come to think of it, Lodestar hadn't heard much swearing for a few moments. Zipping around to the opposite side of the boulder, she was waiting when Presto appeared, crouched low and with a hand already outstretched. A distraction, a new angle of approach, and you didn't even yell a catchphrase. Much better. Keep this up, and you all may just pull off a win. She thought Presto seemed a tad less surly as she hurled him into the sky yet again, perhaps because he'd been recognized for improving. Knowing Professor Quantum, the kids probably hadn't gotten much of that during their time under his tutelage. No sooner was Presto gone than Tashionic was on her. This time, he'd increased the speed of his punches, hoping to cause enough damage to slow her down, or at least have her put on the act. Since Presto was in the air, Agent Quantum was moving at mortal speeds, and Plasmodiia would need time to aim. Lodestar decided this was a fine opportunity for a more personal lesson. Rather than using higher levels of strength, Lodestar dialed in her speed to precisely the same as Tashionic's, resulting in a world stuck in slow motion while they moved as normal. That done, Lodestar didn't brush aside the coming attacks. Instead, she blocked, returning a jab to Tashionic's unprotected ribs. Not enough to take him down, it should feel like a normal blow, meaning that it would hurt without injury. He appeared momentarily stunned, then came in swinging again. There was some form there, he'd had training, but it was all too evident that he'd grown very used to his speed advantage. Lodestar easily avoided the wide swing, countering with another short jab, this one directly to Tashionic's nose. Ow. He staggered, nearly slipping into normal time, as a wave of wetness washed over his eyes. No matter how good you are, getting hit in the face, at least when it causes damage, is going to rock your focus. Hands up. You should be guarding. This isn't a match where you can dodge everything. Slowly, Lodestar was getting a feel for this team. Agent Quantum had the right makings for a leader, but he could be a bit too set on his path to change when needed. Tashionic was stuck in the classic super speed trap. He tried to learn to do everything faster, rather than better. Plasmodiia possessed easily the most stopping power but was kept on the backlands due to her supposed vulnerability, never mind the fact that she had plenty of defensive options. As for Presto, he might actually have the sharpest mind of the four. Pity he seemed intent on concealing and misusing that potential. Sure enough, Tashionic proved her theory by racing and once more. He was going faster this time, because of course he was. That was the Professor Quantum method for overcoming a hurdle. Stronger, faster, tougher, better. Dominate, win, all that idiot crap Lodestar had been forced to dig out by the root when starting the alliance of heroic champions. Had Tashionic taken a moment to truly consider the situation, he'd have remembered that Lodestar was only ever matching his speed. Going faster changed nothing. This wasn't a fight that could be won by adding more More punches, though these were at least a tad tighter than before. Lodestar blocked the first 2 swings, feinted a third jab that Tashionic fell for, and came around with a right hook to his jaw. She tried to hold back, however, moving at those speeds made it difficult to entirely pull the blow. She still sent Tashionic stumbling back onto his butt. With his landing, their time in the land of super speed came to an end. Lodestar decided to re-engage with the other recovering members of the team. Agent Quantum was mostly to his feet, but she could still hear Presto whistling through the air above them. Plasmodiah would fire when given a chance, however, by this point, she'd yet to land a single shot. Hopefully, she'd realize that with Tashionic's speed in play, Lodestar could dodge most ranged attacks and come in closer. She'd love to see what Plasmodiah could do when truly pushed. Unfortunately, knowing the training they'd gotten, Lodestar highly doubted the young woman would break formation. Professor Quantum drilled those lessons and especially hard. As Agent Quantum looked her over, she wondered if he was going to step up. This plan wasn't working, not unless they had a secret reveal prepared for the last moment. There was still time to change things, to try something new, but that would demand throwing away their current tactics. It was a hard call to make for any leader, stick with what they knew, even though it was failing, versus rolling the dice on an untested strategy. With a team this developed, there would be other tactics they could shift to, ones they'd no doubt drilled and polished as much as their current formation. The question was, would any of them work against an opponent as strong as their own team, and could Agent Quantum figure out which? Plasmodiah, switch to rapid shots. Let's keep her dancing. Presto, pick a number between 1 and 100. Count to that, then make your jump. She can't predict your timing if it's randomized. Tashionic, switch to support. Use that speed as a surprise. Don't let her see you coming. I'll take her on in melee. That a fact. Lodestar liked that he changed things up, however, he only shifted the variables, rather than the strategy as a whole. While it could still work, she wasn't holding her breath on that making the difference. In response, Agent Quantum raised his own fists. Since you gave Tashionic a real sparring session, care to teach it to someone who has been more thoroughly trained in hand-to-hand combat? No. Lodestar dashed over, sweeping Agent Quantum's legs and knocking him in the stomach on his way down. The point of that lesson wasn't that he needs a boxing tutor. It's that you all have weaknesses. Knowing what they are allows you to plan around them. Ignoring them leaves opponents an opening to exploit. Although she could see Tashionic preparing for another charge and Plasmodiah building up energy to shoot once more, in her heart Lodestar knew this test had likely reached its conclusion. Much as she'd been hoping they'd think on their feet, it appeared they were continuing on with trying the same thing, only more powerful. It was an issue she'd expected when taking on Professor Quantum's team, and one she dearly hoped could be trained out of them. The other way that lesson sank in wasn't pretty. It came in the field, when a team fought someone truly beyond their abilities, and usually ended in several funerals. Lodestar would do all she could to educate this group before that day came. In the moment, that lesson probably required leaving them publicly defeated. A blow to the ego was far, far better than what awaited them if they didn't learn their lessons during training, even if it meant one more set of superheroes that resented her. She could already see the frustration in their eyes catalyzing into anger. No, they were thinking it wasn't fair, this gulf of power between them. They were right, but it didn't change the fact that they'd eventually fight a stronger opponent. She could bear their resentment, their distance, if it meant they'd be able to survive. One more burden added to the countless on her shoulders. This one, at least, she'd been prepared for since the evaluation started. It was how these things always turned out, sooner or later. Admiration turned to jealousy, annoyance, or frustration as attempt after attempt to surpass her power failed. Standing at the top meant standing alone. Chapter 50. The worryingly thin woman with skin the color of an old lime moved quietly through the front door, causing a large bell overhead to tinkle loudly. Inside the unremarkable door was a wood-paneled hallway leading deeper into the well-aged building. From down the expanse, music drifted along. Nothing remotely modern, this had a peppy, bouncy rhythm. One might have used the word jaunty, even if it weren't normally within their vocabulary. For Lozera, the sound conjured dim memories of her time in the lab. One of the scientists used to leave a television on for her brood at night, believing it would better socialize them with humans. That one had favored older works, some dating back to the days before color. This wasn't a tune she could particularly recall, it was merely in the style of those programs. Lozera was never sure if that scientist was eaten during the escape, or if they'd been out on the fateful day. As the lone survivor, there was no way to ask the others which humans they'd torn apart in the dash to freedom. At the end of the hall, there was a single turn. Down a bit further, another door waited. This one hosted a huge glass pane in the center, marking the business as vaudeville and tune, destructive indestructibles in elaborate gold lettering. She was in the right place, moving silently along the weathered floor. No need to turn the knob, she realized, since the door was cracked. That explained how the music was traveling so well. Pushing her way inside, Lozera found herself looking directly at a desk with a woman behind it. A very distinctive woman, at that, pants held aloft by suspenders, starched shirt, bow tie, a flat-top straw hat, and a plainly plastic mustache that came to absurdly curly points at each end. The moment she saw Lozera enter, the curiously dressed woman sprang to her feet, tipping the straw hat and knocking a bottle of ink Lozera hadn't seen seconds prior onto the floor. It spread across the wood in a dark, oozing puddle, yet the woman paid the spill not the slightest of mind. Good afternoon. Welcome to Fville and Tune, Independent Disaster Contracting. As you might have guessed, I'm Fville in the flesh. What can I do for you today? My employer is interested in your services? She wasn't entirely sure what to make of Fville, having only ever known the woman by reputation. She didn't seem like much outside of an oddball, but that meant nothing. According to reports, she and Tune were among the highest-ranked metas in existence for survivability. The latter had supposedly even survived a scuffle with Fornax. That was the sort of power it was useful to have around. Of course, you did walk into our office. Services must be in demand, so tell me the skinny. Boss have a competing bar we need to go for a dance at. Maybe a business we should patronize? Tell us where you need the chaos, and that's where we'll be. She paused, looking Lozera over more carefully. With some exceptions, by matter of policy. Best to start with the caveats. Lozera might save herself some time. What sorts of exceptions? The expected sort. You see, Tune and I occupy a niche in the laws and protections around metahumans. We exert influence on the world around us simply by existing in it. We cause chaos and trouble no matter where we go. The reason that's legal is because we can't control it, and jailing us for effects outside our control crosses several legal lines. That said, we're also not stooges. Laws can change, you know. It's why we avoid anything related to or around the alliance of heroic champions. Not looking to pick a fight with people who can put the kibosh on our business. About what Lozera had expected. It was standard practice among those who'd been around long enough to build a reputation in the first place. Steering clear of the capes was just good sense, which was what made her employer's aspirations all the rarer. Not many were left who'd challenge the Aussie directly. Luckily, he'd also found places for assets that were technically unconnected from what the capes would be dealing with. That won't be an issue, Lozera replied. Tickled as a hog in hosiery to hear it. Another look, this one more probing. I'll ask your forgiveness for the uncouth addition, but given your overall deadly demeanor, feels prudent to mention we also don't tango with the other side of that equation. Fville and Tune are strictly a civilian service. We avoid the major leagues. Here, unfortunately, they had an issue. From a door on the left, annoyed ranting could be heard. Seconds later, it could also be seen, as actual scribbles and blurred-out symbols manifested in the air. That was the only warning before the door slammed open and a new man ambled through. He had a strange movement to him, a constant bounce, like he was never truly still. His intense expression was a sharp contrast to the bright, cheerful hues he was clad in, and the coiffed bobbing hair swaying atop his skull. It was hard to place this person's age. His skin was off in texture, somehow just not right, but it lacked any signs of aging. Older than a teen, younger than what most would consider a true adult, the man was a shifting tapestry as he took long, unusual steps through the room. Your partner agrees with that, or does he make his own choices? Tune isn't one to get bogged down in details. He prefers the fun, Fville replied. He's also out of beer. Turned into milk again. From a small mini fridge, Tune produced a brown bottle, then very carefully eased the door shut. As soon as it clicked, a stack of books fell from literally nowhere, smacking Fville in the cranium one after another. With every blow, she teetered more and more off balance, until the last one sent her to the ground. Then, moments later, Fville was back up as if nothing had happened. That was the thing about these two, easy to hit, near impossible to hurt. Looking mildly embarrassed by the book slide, Tune managed a repentant expression, albeit not well. This was a bit too commonplace for the pair to feel bad about. Sorry, didn't mean to do that in front of a client. That's quite all right, Tune, Fville assured him. Our guest was leaving anyway, seeing as she's clearly here recruiting for some sort of larger caper, and we don't fit in. Besides, she just tried to play us against each other. I'm not fond of working with those who can't respect the bond between partners. While Lozera was technically here diplomatically, she still felt her spine tense. Perhaps this woman didn't quite realize who she was talking to. Lozera was no mere lackey to be drummed out when someone else's patience wore thin. Tapping her hands against the arms of the chair, Lozera began to rise. Oh, goody and gumption. Toon, looks like you might get to have some fun today after all. Toon looked from Lozera to Vaudeville, then dropped the beer into a wastebasket, where it somehow made a sound like a ringside bell. Putting his right thumb to his mouth, Toon began to blow. As he did, his entire fist swelled in size to absurd, comical proportions. A literal gleam twinkled in both of his now wide eyes, the first signs of genuine excitement he'd shown, all pointed directly at Lozera. Step right on up, my bold challenger. I promise, you ain't never had a fight like me. Helen took her time putting Penelope to bed. They sang songs, had a long tub time, and even did rereads of some favorite stories. It felt good to be here, human and home. She reveled in being around someone who had little care for Lodestar, powers, superheroes, any of it. To Penelope, Helen would be mom above all other titles, and after days like this, she needed that. As all children do, however, Penelope eventually gave in to slumber. Part of her, no, much more than a part, wanted to call Ivan. He understood what it meant to be at the top. The solitude, the distance, the pressure. But it wasn't fair of her to add to his burdens. He was already carrying enough. She was the lodestar, she could haul her own mental crap around. Setting her resolve, Helen wandered into the kitchen and poured a glass of wine. The last drops were nearly fallen when her phone chirped. She knew the sound. Not many people had their own custom tones, but there were those who warranted the distinction. Yanking it out, she prepared for Ivan to tell her something about the Starscoots, or perhaps offer some insight into Tori's kidnapping. Are you free? Well, that was unexpected. Blunt, which did fit Ivan, though he tended to err on the side of formality, at least since taking on his civilian role. Her thumb wavered, unsure of what to write back. Yes, she was free. Yes, she wanted to see him, to share the events of her day. That was the trouble. She liked Ivan, liked being around him. When she'd been living as just Helen, that was one thing. Now, the issue was more complicated. In the end, Helen decided that since there was a chance this could be related to official business, she had a duty to investigate. Even Lodestar was allowed a small bit of self-delusion. For the moment. Something up. She didn't even have time to put the phone down before his reply came. In person. Damn. If he couldn't talk about it even over their secured lines, then this was indeed serious. All thoughts of relaxation and light flirting bolted from Helen's mind as she tried to predict what threat they might be facing. Come over and read me in. Again, she didn't set the phone down in time. Another chirp, another message. Reading it twice, Helen lifted an eyebrow and walked through the house to her back door. Popping it open, she stepped onto her porch to find Ivan already sitting there, staring out at the night sky. There was something in his expression, a pain she'd seen prior incarnations of, though never to this degree. A joke about personal property faded on her tongue. This was no laughing matter. Ivan, what's wrong? She expected him to need some time, but that made little sense. Ivan had come to her to talk. He wasn't going to hold back when the chance finally arrived. Rick has started to remember the beach. Enough that he asked about it, and I told him the truth of that day. He still hasn't asked the big questions yet, but it's only a matter of time. Lowering his gaze, Ivan pressed his hands against his forehead. My son is going to see me as a monster, and I don't know how to stop it. Or even if I should stop it. He has a right to know my history, the people with grudges certainly will. Taking her time, Helen went into the house, scooping up a pair of old quilts. Stepping back out, she hunkered down in the chair next to Ivan, handing over the blanket. Summer is ending. The nights are starting to chill. Remember, have to look human. While Ivan worked out which part of the quilt was the top, Helen continued. I don't know what to say about the Rick stuff. That bite's the big one. No, bad call, forget that. It just sucks, Ivan, and I wish I could say something to make it better. Except, the truth is, this was always a hurdle you two had to climb. Eventually, our kids will find out we're more than just their parents. Some have an easier adjustment to make than others, but Rick is smart. He'll be able to see the bigger picture. Whether or not he can make peace with it, that's up to him to decide. Sadly, I am all too aware. Ivan had finally managed to get the blanket oriented appropriately, letting it sit at his waist like an elderly man at a chessboard. For a moment, Helen tried to imagine old Ivan. It didn't work. He, like her, was largely unchanging, save only for when he made the big changes. She couldn't imagine Ivan living to an old age any more than herself. Superheroes and villains alike, they were both fated to go out with their masks on. The only upside is I can offer comfort on one level. You don't need to worry about Rick or Beth being targets. Not from the Aussie, and not from anyone within punching distance of me. We don't ever talk about how much you've done for me and Penelope. Ivan interrupted her. I was paying back. Cut the crap. Helen interrupted right back. Paying me back for helping you get the freedom you'd earned doesn't entail a tenth of what you've done over the years. From the very start, you were the one who gave me the downtime to have her, and since then, you've been a constant help when I probably leaned on too much during the rough times. It was always surprising when Ivan could somehow manage to look even more serious than he normally did, yet as he stared Helen down, she was nearly captured by the gravity in his gaze. Trifles and pittance. Everything I love, I have in my life because of your help. There is no way to repay that debt, though I owe you a lifetime of effort in trying. Guess what? That feeling flows both ways. Finally fiddling with her own blanket, Helen snapped it out in a single movement, letting it settle naturally over her chair and body. After all you've done for Penelope, I owe at least that level of care to your kids. So whatever else you might be scared of in all of this, try not to worry about their safety. I'm not perfect, nor infallible, but so long as the power is mine to wield, your kids will always have Lodestar in their corner. It would have shocked most people to see Ivan relax at those words, even slightly. He was not a man of casual ease, nor one prone to trusting. But he knew more than most of the world. He'd seen how much power Lodestar could truly wield when the need arose. For the moment, Ivan allowed himself a minute measure of peace. Likely the very thing he'd come here hoping to find. Much as my pride wants to decline the gesture, for the sake of my children, I thank you sincerely. Ivan lowered his head, almost managing a bow despite their seated positions. And I'm sorry for interrupting your evening so abruptly. Given the situation, I get it. Honestly, I'm sort of glad you showed up. My day was a pain, as well. It's nice to sit with an old friend. An old friend, an old enemy, an old rival, an old asset, even an old partner for the occasional shared adversary. After all these years, there were few roles they hadn't filled for the other at some point along the way. Only a few were left purposefully, willfully untouched, no matter how much either of them might wish to be sharing a single quilt. Anything interesting? I could use a distraction. This question, thankfully, Helen had an easy response to. I got shot in the face by a bunch of birds. A sincere, contemplative look fell over Ivan's face. Do you mean you were hit by a large amount of birds, or a flock of them banded together to actually shoot some sort of tiny guns at you? There was no particular reason why that got her, but seeing the man once known as Fornax ask such a question with a straight face sent Helen into convulsions of laughter that took a full minute to fade. Chapter 51. Sunday evening arrived too soon for Tori, who'd spent nearly every spare second since her meeting with Dr. Mechanical down in the lab, hard at work. She needed to get a fully functioning prototype built so she'd have actual specs. Until they knew the exact size and shape, she couldn't very well tap Beverly to start much of the design work. It had been one thing when this was all an idea, just some fun notion to sink her energy into rather than dwelling on everything that had happened. Having Indigo Technologies professionally on board changed things. Now, it had the potential to be real, and Tori was determined not to let the chance slip away. When Beverly finally dragged her out of the lab, it was a blessing. She'd been at it for a long time without any breaks, and was starting to slow down mentally. Changing gears would give her brain time to rest. It wasn't as if game night with the new science sentries would demand the same level of intense focus. After a shower and a few cups of coffee, Tori was more or less as functional as she got outside of things that interested her. She expected to coast her way through the evening in a subdued manner, letting the more boisterous members of their social circle pick up the slack. Once the knock on their door came, however, the flaw in that plan became apparent. It was a weary foursome that arrived at their door. None looked especially well rested, and their overall energy was somewhere on Tori's level, which was worrying. The sole member putting up the appearance of pep was Austin, who greeted Chloe cheerfully when she let them in. Good evening, and thank you again for having us. We brought some playing cards, wine, and a